I'm Noel Latif, President of the Foreign Policy Association, and I would like to welcome back to our forum Quebec's Finance Minister, Eric Girard. I'd like to congratulate Minister Girard for a budget he recently unveiled that emphasizes education and health. We have on our board of directors at the Foreign Policy Association the Chancellor of the City University of New York, CUNY, Felix Matos Rodriguez, whose motto is a degree for every dream. Yes, a degree for every dream. And what a nice, and economic growth and progress starts with the dreams of our young people. Indeed, what better authority to invoke than Albert Einstein, who observed that imagination is more important than knowledge. Indeed, he remarked, imagination is everything. Countries like Singapore, South Korea, Ireland that have invested in their people enjoy higher per capita income than countries that are rich in natural resources. So, Minister Girard, chapeau. And what a nice touch to announce Quebec's budget at a Longueuil school with Quebec's Minister of Education at your side. We have so many new people here to the Foreign Policy Association that we thought we would show you a very brief clip prepared by NBC News about our old and honorable association.
It began as an ideal, shared by visionaries who saw a world where American foreign policy was debated not only in think tanks and universities, but in community centers, libraries, and homes across the country.
Klamath Falls has what is called a Great Decisions Group. There are about 15,000 of them across the country.
Military action is the only action that keeps the communists contained anywhere.
Would you go to war over Vietnam and Laos?
I certainly would do anything to find one all-out war over there.
They imagined an organization that would inform us all to shape the future. An organization dedicated to gathering the best research and offering the facts of world issues without bias. Knowledge made accessible and shared to change our world for the better.
Tonight I am speaking as a guest of the Foreign Policy Association, a nationwide organization, a distinguished organization.
People keep inquiring whether I would do it all over again. My answer is yes. The problem is no one has asked me.
I would like to express my appreciation to the Foreign Policy Association for helping bring this group together today.
Today, the FPA's flagship Great Decisions program is the largest discussion program on global affairs. Each week at community centers nationwide, participants read the Great Decisions briefing book and watch the television series before discussing and debating the most critical global issues facing America. In high schools and universities across the country, graduates of FPA's Teacher Training Institute design Great Decisions courses for their students. In their homes, millions of Americans watch the Emmy-nominated Great Decisions television series on public television, delivering essential background and diverse perspectives, challenging viewers to make their own great decisions.
I am very happy to have participated in the Great Decision programs and the work of the Foreign Policy Association. There needs to be more education in terms of what is going on abroad in order to fully understand how it affects our own people.
And in New York City, the FPA continues to attract world leaders to engage its members and the public.
I think this organization can make a major contribution to fulfilling our responsibilities as a people.
I have been for many years, long before I was in the United States Senate, a great admirer of this institution and what it's done and what it does. And I think the role it will continue to play in a very complicated world.
Through its balanced, nonpartisan programs and publications, the FPA encourages Americans to discuss and debate world issues and to participate in the foreign policy process. For a century, the Foreign Policy Association has operated under the mantra that a properly functioning democracy depends on an informed citizenry, a beacon that will illuminate our next century. Thank you for your support and for your participation.
And let me flag that the Great Decisions Teacher Training Institute is unique in that it brings high school teachers from all over North America. Indeed, we have teachers from Canada, including a large contingent from Quebec and from Mexico. And surprisingly, there are few such institutes around the country, so we're very proud of it. So it now gives me great pleasure to turn the podium, the microphone, over to the extraordinary Delegate General of Quebec, Martine Hébert, to formally introduce Minister Girard. Martine?
Bonjour, merci. Merci beaucoup, Noël, pour votre accueil extrêmement chaleureux. Bonjour et un grand merci à vous toutes et tous pour votre présence aujourd'hui. Thank you all for coming today. I'd like, of course, to begin thanking the Foreign Policy Association and Dr. Noël Latif and his team for hosting this event today. Noël, your dedication to building and strengthening the bond between Quebecers and New Yorkers over the years has been one of a kind. We're very grateful. Merci beaucoup. I'm also delighted to see many distinguished guests here in this room, and I would like to extend a special welcome to Consul Général of Canada, Monsieur Tom Clark. Also to Mrs. Doreen Harris, President and CEO of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I think it's the first time I have it in long, and we always say NYSERDA, but Mrs. Harris is with us today, so thank you to both of you for joining us. And now, you know, it's a real privilege for me to talk about a little bit about our speaker today, the Quebec's Finance Minister, Mr. Éric Girard. Since being elected in October 2018, Mr. Girard has played a crucial role in steering the province's economic and financial strategy. His tenure is marked by a commitment to sustainable growth, fiscal responsibility, and strategic investments that align with the province's long-term economic goals. A native of Sept-Îles, which some of you may know here, who was raised in Quebec City and studied in Montreal, Mr. Girard has more than 25 years of experience in the investment and financial market sector. Prior to becoming minister, he had been treasurer of the National Bank of Canada since November 2011. He is keenly interested in economics, education, sports, and public policy, and he's also socially involved in many causes, like he's also a board member, sorry, it's a bad English day today. So, he's a board member of the Fondation CHU Sainte-Justine. He also holds a BA Joint Honors in Economics and Finance from the McGill University, and he has a master's degree in economics from Université du Québec à Montréal. He is one of our most respected figures in finance, and I can assure you that the province of Quebec is very, very fortunate to have him as its Minister of Finance. So without further ado, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Monsieur Éric Girard, Ministre des Finances du Québec.
Okay, so it's a bit tricky because I'm not seeing the presentation, so I know it, though. So thanks to the Foreign Policy Association, I think it's my third time here, so it's always a pleasure to be here. Merci beaucoup d'être ici aujourd'hui. And perhaps before I start, I'd like to sum up the province of Quebec in two numbers. Because sometimes, I guess, from afar, it can be hard to, let me try to do this. And maybe I'll give you this. See if we have less interference. Okay. So when you think of Quebec, you should think of two numbers. We are 22% of the population of Canada, but only 20% of its economy. And of course, we used to be 28% of the population of Canada, and we crossed 25, and we're now at 22, and it's pretty much guaranteed that we will hit 20 sometimes around 2040. And the question is, when we become 20% of the population of Canada, what percentage of its economy are we going to be? And so everything that we do is trying to ensure that when we are 20% of the population, we would be 25% of the Canadian economy. And so if we could punch above our weight, rather than lagging the Canadian average, then we would have more influence on Canada than we've ever had in a long time. And of course, the other thing that you should know is that our official language is French. So we're 9 million citizens on a very large geographical area, and most of us live along the St. Lawrence River. And we speak French and English, and let's go. Okay. So when you live in the States, you hear that the economy is resilient and that inflation is sticky. When you live in Canada, you hear, or you should hear, that the economy is stagnant and the inflation is sticky. So in fact, we haven't, in Quebec, we haven't grown for a year. We haven't been in a recession. We've had job growth. But we didn't have GDP growth. And so Canada is about the same. We had population growth, job growth, and no growth. And therefore, very little, we had negative productivity. And so that's very important and very different than the situation in the US. And so we just tabled a budget. And from a fiscal point of view, we hit a speed bump. And I'll explain you why. It's because the economy is stagnant. We often hear about climate change. In our case, we had the worst forest fire in the history of Quebec last summer, and you guys got the smoke, I think, at some point. We also had drought with the fires, and so we had less water in Hydro-Quebec reservoir and less exports and less revenues in our Crown Corporation. So stagnant economy, climate change cost, and we had labor negotiation with our public employees that deliver healthcare and education. And a province in Canada, its number one responsibility is to deliver public health care and public schools. And so because we had important labor negotiation, our costs went up. So when you sum up these three things, we hit a speed bump from a fiscal point of view. And now the question is, what are we going to do with it? Are we dealing with it? And we are. And that's what I'll try to explain to you today. And okay, and this is just telling you that we had no growth in 2023, that we'll have 0.6% GDP growth in 2024, but it's really two stories. It is no growth in the first half and good growth or trend growth near 1.6, 1.7 in the second half of 2024 as interest rate and inflation goes down. So the spark, like we're not in a recession, we're not growing. The sparks we need is lower inflation, lower interest rates. Okay, so I've told you who we are. So what do we do well? What should Quebec be known for? Well, we're known for public daycare. We have the largest participation rate of women in North America because we have accessible daycare. We have low-cost clean energy, as you really well know in New York. We have a strong, diversified, resilient economy. We have 4 universities in Montreal. We have free trade agreements. That is Canada, but that's us. We have free trade agreements with 1.5 billion customers. And we have economic tool, the Caisse de dépôt de placement, which is a 400 billion Canadian pension fund, totally independent of the Quebec government, but a big actor in the Quebec economy. And we have Investissement Québec, which is a crown corporation, also investing. And which part of the world economy do we have a competitive advantage? So we have 5 strategic sectors. Artificial intelligence, that you would know from the works at McGill University, Université de Montréal, and Joshua Bengio. We have aluminum production, the most competitive aluminum production in North America because of our hydroelectricity. We have life science. Moderna recently chose Montreal for its head office in Canada. We have aerospace. And we have the battery sector or the electric vehicle component from the critical mineral that we have in the large area of Quebec, all the way to the battery pack production with, in our case, Nordvolt, the Swedish company, will produce batteries in Quebec. Okay, and I'm an economist, so I like to consult economists. I like to consult academic economists. So from time to time, we do public consultation and we ask them, what should we do? And it's very important because they tend to tell us very simple things, but that we tend to forget. That we should be investing more in education and training. And by the way, you should invest more in early education because your return is longer. If you invest in a 4-year-old, you probably get an 80-year return. If you invest in a 24-year-old, you get a 60-year return. So we should invest a lot in public early education. They're also telling us that our tax system is a little complicated, and I'll talk more about that because we're going to need to be looking for savings, and a lot of the savings are in our complicated tax system. And we tend to have a lot of regulation around the environment, around data, personal data protection. We have legislation around language policy. We tend to have the government, it takes a big place in the economy. So our regulatory burden is probably it's well intended, but can be a burden. And we need to boost productivity in the private sector. You guys most come from the private sector. We all, politicians all like to say that the private sector should be more productive. But by the way, the government too. We can do a lot better, especially in the healthcare sector. which is 43% of our budget. And people are paying, the highest marginal tax rate in Quebec is 53%. And so you're paying, if you're the highest bracket, you're paying 53%. It takes 43% of the Quebec budget, and you still have difficulties accessing healthcare services, public healthcare services. So we need productivity improvements there. Okay, so those are a lot of numbers. I'll go quickly. So usually, this is my 6th year as the finance minister of Quebec. Usually, a budget for Quebec is about $15 billion Canadian over 5 years. So $3 billion per year of new initiative. This year, we went for 8. Why? Because our fiscal position was more difficult. Most of that $8 billion went to healthcare and education, our main responsibilities. And because we had a larger deficit than we wanted, we decided to work on what we call optimizing government action, which is really reduce subsidies for private corporation and ask for increased performance from Crown Corporation. And so the net of the budget was $6 billion that you should compare to a traditional budget would be $15 billion of initiative over 5 years. So for this crowd, smaller budget because of a tougher fiscal situation, but still focused on healthcare and education, which are our main responsibilities. Okay, this I've said already. Okay, just why is it? So part of the difficulties we have with respect to fiscal. So our deficit this year was 1.5% of GDP. But remember, we're a province, so you can't compare our 1.5 to France or the US. So you would need to add the Canadian deficit, which is probably another 1.5. So somewhere Quebec, Canada, in Quebec is around 3% of GDP deficit. Okay, so why did we have to pay more for our employees? Well, first of all, the Quebec government was paying less than the federal government and municipalities. So that works when the unemployment rate is at 10%. It doesn't work when the unemployment rate is sub 5%. Suddenly, and it doesn't work when the federal government allows you to work from home. And so suddenly, we're competing against entities that are paying more and not doesn't have the burden of the geography or having to move to the nation capital, to Ottawa, for example. And so we paid 17.4% wage increase over 5 years, and that has an impact for us. So our deficit is $8.8 billion in traditional terms, and I'll explain why. There has been talk of the 11. I'll show you why. But $3 billion of that is associated to the wage settlement. And what you should know is we want to improve the quality of public education and healthcare. So we're investing in infrastructure, digital transformation, governance. All these things are important, but nothing will get done unless we have employees. If we have employee shortage, no matter how much we invest in infrastructure, we will not succeed. No matter how good our governance is, we will not succeed. You cannot deliver healthcare without doctors and nurses and orderlies. And so it's an important expense, but it is at the core of what we need to do, which is deliver public healthcare and public school. Okay, I've mentioned our goal. So we have a very ambitious economic agenda. We started in 2018 the gap with Ontario. So Ontario is our main competitor. It's 1.7 the population of Quebec, 2 times the size of its economy, same geography, same access to the US, same weather, same country. And so we had a gap of GDP per capita of 17% in 2018. We're now at 13, and we want to close this to 10 in 2026 and keep going down. We compare each other to outperform. Okay, so if you're in the financial market and you're buying our bonds, because for us, we're on an investor relation tour, and tomorrow we'll be in Paris, and Thursday we'll be in London, and back in Montreal on Friday. But you'll hear of an $11 billion Canadian deficit. That's because we have what we call a generation fund, where we invest $2.2 billion in this case in order to pay for capital expenditure. Because you need to remember that from a public accounting point of view, when your balance from a revenues minus expense, even though your debt is still growing, because your balance from an OPEX point of view, but your CAPEX is increasing your debt. And so the generation fund goes against our CAPEX. And it's very helpful. So 11 billion minus 2.2 that goes against the CAPEX, against reducing debt, is 8.8 billion, 1.5% of GDP. There is a contingency reserve there for slowdown, adapting to climate change, extra healthcare cost. And if you go from 8.8 to 7.3, you're down to 1.2% of GDP. Okay. Oh, no, I'll leave it at that. Okay. So this is our financial framework. Deficit of 11 billion going down to 8, and then we have what we call a 4 billion structural deficit. And that's what we need to take care of. We need to be balanced after contributing to the generation fund, which leave us in a small OPEX surplus, and the generation fund contribution goes against CAPEX. So we have a $4 billion challenge to deal with. So question number one, do we have a revenue problem or do we have an expense problem? And so that's very important because I mean, I'm a macroeconomist, and my role is really the stewardship of the public finance of Quebec. And you need to get the big things right first. It's a very important question. Do we have a revenue problem or do we have an expense problem? And so the scoop is we have an expense problem because we're coming out of a pandemic, and a lot of what we call temporary expenses during the pandemic, it turns out that it's permanent. We will keep vaccination clinic. We will keep PPE equipment. We will still subsidize private residence for seniors. We're subsidizing private residence for seniors because if we don't, they close. And so we thought when we started doing this during the pandemic that these were temporary measures, but they're permanent. And so we used to have 24% of GDP in expenses. We went as high as 30, and we're still at 26.7. And you can tell that revenues were 26.1, 25. And so we've managed, by lowering income taxes, to keep the weight of revenue in the economy. It is now what it was before the pandemic. So every revenue that we got from inflation, we gave back to citizens. But the expense that we thought were temporary are not. And so we have an expense problem. And we can do two things. We can look the other way and keep making deficit, or we can deal with it. And we will deal with it, but this is not very popular. So we reduce subsidies for private corporation. We were subsidizing wages in the video game industries and in some digital industries and in the animation and visual transformation of the cinema industries. And these subsidies were created when the unemployment rate was at 10%. And we're now at full employment. And so we're reducing these subsidies by 20%. And we're asking, in 2018, we wanted our Crown Corporation that are selling liquors and games and lotteries, and we wanted them to be more efficient. But then when the pandemic hit, we shelved that request, and we just said, try to stay open. And now, again, we'll make an effort there. But now, we're still left, so that's what we've done, and we're still left with that $4 billion structural deficit. And we're going to do two things. We're going to review our tax expenditure, and we're going to review our budgetary expenditure. And in our tax expenditure, we have 277 measures for a total of $50 billion a year of tax expenditure. And some of these we will never reduce, like child care benefit and things like that. But others we will look at. And we have 136 billion of budgetary expenditure. 65% of that is for education and healthcare. 50% of that is labor. So it's not because you have 136 billion of expenditure that you can easily cut 2 billion. But we will try to do it. So we have a complete review over the next year in order to present the path to fiscal balance at the next budget. And so a lot of people said, so why don't you present your plan now? Well, now we have no growth. So if I compress fiscal expense when we have no growth, I'm just going to be provoking a recession for nothing. Yeah, it won't work. Just if you're the opposition in Quebec City and you're asking questions to the finance minister, you're saying, why wait a year for your plan? Well, because reducing expense now would be terrible from an economic point of view. And if you know anything about Canada, you know that federal-provincial relationship is like a national sport. Okay? So I'm here, I'll complain about the federal government, the finance minister of Canada will come here, perhaps, and she's very good, by the way, she'll complain about provinces. And it's a national sport, okay? But let me take one shot at it, okay? They should not create new programs unless they finance the existing one properly. That's my point of view. That's the point of view of our government. It's a good idea to create a dental care program and a pharmacare program. Who's against pharmacare? Nobody. Those are good programs, good ideas. The only problem is we need to fund healthcare properly first. Okay, let's deal with healthcare, and then we'll see if we can expand coverage. Okay, that was enough of Quebec-Canada relation. This, if you're American, this must be so boring. Federal-provincial relation between Quebec and Canada. Okay. The generation fund. It should be about, it should be no more than 10% of our net debt. We keep it, so we have gross debt and we subtract the generation fund and other investment to go to net debt. And it's a great asset, a great tool, it's very much appreciated. Okay, that's net debt to GDP. We're at 39%. We were at 41 before the pandemic. We were at 54 in 2013. The Canadian average is 30%, the Canadian average of the 10 provinces. And so we want to go from 39 to 30 over 15 years. And so we want to do this slowly, but there's no reason why Nova Scotia or Manitoba budget is today, by the way, so we'll look for the net debt to GDP of Manitoba. But there's no reason why, I mean, Alberta has oil and gas, and BC is very wealthy, and they have access to Asia. So we'll never be Alberta or BC, but there's no reason why Quebec should have more debt than Nova Scotia or Manitoba. Okay, these are the slides. I should have introduced the people that are with me today. Julie Girard, Deputy Minister. Vicky Fortin, chef de cabinet. Guillaume Pichard, responsable du financement. So the responsible of our funding program wants me to tell you that we have a weighted average maturity of 11 years, that 77% of our debt is Canadian, 23% is foreign, that we just issued 2.5 billion 10-year euros late March and 3.7 billion US 5-year early April, the largest Canadian dollar issue ever. 3.7 billion US is $5 billion Canadian in one issue. Thank you if you did participate. And that's Guillaume who does all that great job. And Guillaume would like me to tell you that the average cost of our debt is 3.73% and that we're currently paying about 4.25. So we don't, treasurer or finance minister, we don't like issuing when our marginal cost is higher than our average cost. And so we like to control how much we issue. And we swap everything into Canadian dollar. And that's about it, I think. Those are our issues. And these are our ratings. We're the AA rated issuer. We take very much pride into this. And we will need to go back to balance quickly. And we need to prove that we're taking this seriously. And that's why we did action right away. And we will do more action with the exam. So on this, I think that was my last slide. It's probably my last slide since it doesn't change. Okay, I would be happy to take a few questions. Merci beaucoup. There was a conclusion, but the conclusion is invest in education. Okay.
That follows from a letter that Larry Fink just issued, the chairman of BlackRock, suggesting that there is a crisis in the United States with retirement, that we have managed to lengthen people's lives, but we have not managed to provide for their well-being as they live longer. Does Quebec face a similar crisis?
I think we might have a financial literacy challenge. There's not enough school hours to teach everything that we should teach at school. Like we want to do sex ed, and we want to do financial education and economics, and what I see is that we have a gap in financial literacies. So people do not realize that the earlier you start saving, the better, and that if you want to maintain 60% of your workday's income when you're retired, you need to have such and such amount of capital. So the way we look at it in Quebec is through the financial literacy lens, and we can do a lot better. A question on federal-provincial relation, maybe? From a Canadian.
Oh, I'm not touching that. I've had many of those conversations. But I am seriously interested. You kind of skipped over quickly your interest in batteries and electric vehicles and the availability of rare earths and material. There's a lot of interest in the United States at the moment, as you can appreciate, in terms of domestic supply, particularly of those strategic assets which will facilitate and propel us into the new energy economy. I think Quebec has a mother lode, as I recall. Many of us were in a room like this a decade ago hearing about Plan Nord. So can you just touch on longer term the availability of Quebec's role in the changing economy, the energy economy?
So if you look at the history of Quebec, we didn't transform our natural resource. So we had iron ore and aluminum, and we did the original transformation. And if you go back 50 years ago, some of these companies were American and like extract, ship overseas or in the US. And so with the electric vehicle battery, what we're trying to do is to be integrated. So we do have the critical mineral, and we want to produce the anode and the cathode and then the battery pack. And we, in all likelihood, we will not produce cars. Ontario will. We just need to be careful that the economics works out, okay? Because we're in a world competition for all these materials, and we have important environmental standards that are important but tend to raise costs. And in some of these components, we're competing against jurisdictions that do not have the same standard. Not always the case, but in some case. And so from a taxpayer point of view, like we have an economy minister who could tell you exactly which mine we have and where we're going and how great this is. I'm looking at it from the taxpayer point of view. We need to make sure that that the economics make sense. And some of these manufacturing is so competitive that sometimes we're at the margin. And that's my perspective. But from the economic perspective, the fact that we're integrated and go from the critical mineral to the battery is fantastic. We've never succeeded in doing that in Quebec, and we will with Nordvolt.
Well, Minister Girard, thank you for a very informative tour d'horizon, and we hope that when we meet this time next year, you will have met all your targets. Thank you.
Merci.